What if the oldest words humanity ever pressed into clay were already forgetting something? Not forgetting by accident, but by inheritance. The tablets lie broken and whole at the same time, whispering of gods, kings, and floods, yet never of a true beginning. As if the story started mid-sentence, long after the first voice had gone silent, there is a peculiar calm in that absence, like standing in ruins after the dust has settled, unsure of what once stood there. Tonight we move slowly through that silence, listening not for answers, but for what refuses to be said. Join me gently on this long descent into uncertainty with historic sleep. And before you feel too comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, only if you truly enjoy what I'm doing here. You're also welcome to share your location and local time, wherever you're listening from. The first thing scholars notice when they sit with the Sumerian tablets long enough is not what is written, but what never appears. The clay speaks of gods descending, of kingship arriving as if delivered from elsewhere, of cities rising already named and measured. Yet nowhere does the text pause to explain how existence itself began. There is no genesis in the modern sense, no cosmic ignition, no primal moment carved into certainty. The record opens as if the world has already been running for a very long time, and the scribes are merely catching up. This absence is not subtle, it is consistent, deliberate in its repetition. The Anunnaki are introduced not as creators pulling matter from void, but as figures of authority stepping into an established order. They assign roles, distribute domains, arbitrate disputes. Heaven and earth are already separated. Rivers already know their courses. Humanity already labours, already worships, already remembers something older than itself. The tablets never slow down to explain how any of this came to be. They behave as though beginnings are either irrelevant or unknowable. Modern readers often bring an expectation shaped by later religious frameworks, where origins sit at the centre of meaning. But the Sumerian worldview seems indifferent to that desire. What mattered was continuity, not inception, stability, not origin. The scribes wrote for administrators, priests and kings, not for philosophers searching for first causes. And yet, even within that pragmatic lens, the silence feels heavy. Civilizations usually mythologize their birth. They anchor legitimacy in creation stories. Sumer does neither, at least not in any form that survived. The clay itself offers a clue. These tablets were not meant to last forever. They were records of transactions, hymns recited aloud, rituals performed repeatedly. Knowledge lived as much in memory as in matter. What was written down was already a selection, already filtered. If something did not appear, it may not have been forgotten. It may have been withheld. The absence of beginnings could reflect a cultural understanding that the true origin lay beyond the human right to narrate. There is also the problem of inheritance. Sumer did not emerge from nothing. Archaeology reveals layers beneath the first cities, traces of earlier settlements, earlier tools, earlier attempts at order. By the time writing appears, Sumerians were inheritors of a long, quiet prehistory. Perhaps the scribe stood at a point where the past was already fragmented, its earliest chapters lost to floods, erosion, or time itself. Writing begins not at the dawn, but after the first forgetting. Flood narratives loom large in the tablets, but they are framed not as creation events, rather as resets. Civilization is interrupted, punished, thinned out, then resumed. The world survives, the gods survive, knowledge survives, unevenly. This suggests a worldview shaped by cycles rather than origins. Each age inherits ruins from the last. Each restart feels incomplete. In such a framework, asking about the very first beginning may have felt meaningless, or even dangerous. Translation adds another veil. Words like created, fashioned, or brought forth enter English through interpretive choices. In the original language, the verbs often imply organization rather than creation, arrangement rather than invention. The gods set things in order. They establish boundaries. They assign functions. Matter itself is assumed. Existence is a given. The mystery lies not in why there is something, but in who controls it. This challenges a modern instinct to place the Anunnaki at the start of everything. The tablets resist that placement. They depict the Anunnaki as part of a system already in motion, bound by rules older than their authority. They swear oaths, follow decrees, answer to cosmic principles that are never fully defined. Power exists, but it is constrained. Even the gods seem to operate within a framework they did not design. The silence around beginnings may also reflect social control. Origins grant power. To define the beginning is to define legitimacy. By keeping the beginning vague, authority remains flexible, adaptable. Kingship descends from the gods, but the gods themselves have no narrated birth that humans can trace or challenge. The chain of command vanishes into mist beyond verification. This is not ignorance, it is structure. There is a quiet humility embedded here, though it does not feel gentle. Humanity is not centered. The universe does not revolve around a human story. The tablets suggest a world that does not explain itself to those living inside it. People are tenants, not owners, record keepers, not authors of reality. The absence of a beginning reinforces that position. Humans arrive after the fact, late to a story already underway. What remains unsettling is how consistent this pattern is across texts, genres, and centuries. Hymns, epics, administrative lists, kingly boasts all share the same blind spot. No accident survives that long. Something was either lost very early or intentionally never preserved. The result is the same. A civilization famous for being first leaves its most fundamental question unanswered. And so the tablets sit in museums and archives, cracked but legible, offering names, dates, and divine hierarchies, while withholding the one thing modern minds search for most eagerly. The beginning is not missing because it was forgotten yesterday. It may never have been written at all. The story opens in the middle, and everyone involved seems content to leave it that way. Writing did not emerge in a vacuum of curiosity. It appeared inside institutions that needed control, memory, and order. The earliest scribes were not poets searching for truth, nor philosophers tracing the arc of existence. They were trained specialists working under temples and palaces, taught to shape clay into compliance. Their hands learned repetition before creativity, accuracy before imagination. What they recorded was what power required to endure. This matters because writing, in its first form, was never neutral. It was selective by design. Grain counts, labour rosters, offerings to gods, boundary descriptions. These were the first marks pressed into clay. The world was already divided into roles, hierarchies, and obligations before the stylus ever touched the surface. Writing entered history not to explain reality, but to manage it. That purpose leaves fingerprints everywhere in what survives. The scribes did not write as individuals. They wrote as a class, trained through rigid curricula, copying the same lists, the same formulas, the same hymns across generations. Innovation was discouraged. Deviation meant error. A tablet was valuable not because it was original, but because it was correct. In such an environment, certain questions simply had no place. Origins did not feed workers, justify taxes, or reinforce ritual authority. Continuity did. The myths that eventually took shape followed this same logic. They are not spontaneous folk tales bubbling up from collective wonder. They are structured narratives reflecting institutional priorities. Gods resemble administrators. Cosmic conflicts mirror bureaucratic disputes. Order is praised, chaos punished. The world is presented as something to be maintained, not explained. The scribes inherit a reality already arranged, and their task is to keep it legible. There is a quiet conservatism embedded in this system. Knowledge is preserved, but only within narrow boundaries. What is remembered must serve the present structure. Anything that threatens stability, anything that destabilizes authority, fades from record. This does not require conspiracy. It emerges naturally from the mechanics of survival. A civilization surrounded by uncertainty clings to what works. Questions about ultimate beginnings offer no protection against floods, droughts, or rival cities. Even literacy itself was restricted. Writing was not a communal act. It belonged to a small, educated elite. Most people encountered history through ritual recitation, not personal reading. What they heard had already been filtered, standardized, approved. Oral memory and written memory reinforced each other, narrowing over time. Once something fell outside that loop, recovery became nearly impossible. The training texts used by scribes are revealing. They include long lists of words, professions, animals, materials, cities, an obsession with classification. The universe is broken into manageable categories. To name something is to contain it. But categories assume prior existence. They do not ask how the category came into being. They accept the world as a given inventory, not a mystery. This worldview produces a subtle psychological effect. When a society grows accustomed to managing reality, it stops wondering where reality came from. The focus shifts from origin to function. What does this God oversee? What does this ritual ensure? What does this law preserve? The past becomes a tool, not a question. The deeper past, especially one without immediate relevance, dissolves into silence. There are hints that this silence was already ancient even to the scribes themselves. Some texts refer to times before cities, before kingship, before structured worship. These references are brief, vague, and emotionally distant. They do not invite exploration. They serve as contrast, not memory. The implication is that whatever came before was chaotic, unrecordable, perhaps even dangerous to dwell upon. Writing fixes memory, but it also freezes it. Once a version of the world is inscribed, it resists change. Over centuries, that version gains authority simply by endurance. Later scribes copy earlier tablets not because they fully understand them, but because tradition demands it. Meaning erodes, form remains. The beginning, if it was ever partially known, becomes increasingly abstract, eventually slipping beyond reconstruction. There is also the burden of survival. Clay tablets last only when conditions allow. Floods, fires, abandonment, entire archives vanish. What survives does so unevenly. Administrative texts endure by sheer volume. Philosophical speculation, if it existed, would have been rarer, more fragile. The record is biased toward repetition, not reflection. Silence accumulates where curiosity once might have lived. The result is a historical mirror that reflects function without origin. A civilization appears fully formed, already organized, already justified. Gods rule, humans serve, rituals bind the two. The story begins where order is visible. Everything before that is darkness, not because it was empty, but because no one in power needed it illuminated. This does not mean the scribes were deceivers. They worked within constraints shaped by necessity and tradition. Their silence is structural, not malicious. Yet that silence shapes everything that follows. Later cultures inherit these texts and mistake absence for insignificance. The missing beginning becomes an afterthought, rather than a wound. What lingers is the sense that writing arrived too late to capture the first fracture. Civilization had already restarted itself at least once. Memory had already been edited by catastrophe. The scribes stand at the edge of a broken timeline, faithfully recording what remains, unaware of how much has already slipped beyond recovery. And so the tablets speak clearly about gods and kings, labour and law, while remaining strangely mute about the deepest question of all. The hands that shaped them were trained to preserve order, not to interrogate it. Whatever truth lay before that order hardened into tradition, it passed unrecorded, leaving behind a history that begins only after forgetting has already done its work. Kingship, according to the Sumerian record, does not emerge from human ambition. It descends. The phrase appears again and again, carved with calm certainty, as if it were a natural law rather than a claim. Kingship descended from heaven, already formed, already legitimate, already unquestionable. No experiment, no trial period, no memory of learning how to rule. Authority arrives complete, like a tool forged elsewhere and handed down for use. This idea carries weight far beyond politics. If power itself is presented as an external gift, then humanity is never positioned as an originator. People receive structures, they inherit systems, they occupy roles assigned before their arrival. The world of the tablets feels assembled prior to human participation, leaving no conceptual space for a first human choice or a foundational social contract. Order precedes agency. The earliest king lists reinforce this sensation of interruption rather than beginning. They stretch backward into spans of time that feel unreal, with reigns lasting tens of thousands of years. These numbers are not practical records. They function symbolically, stretching memory into a haze where chronology dissolves. The farther back the list reaches, the less human it feels. Time becomes elastic, mythic, unanchored from lived experience. Then, abruptly, the tone shifts. After a great flood, rains shorten, cities change. The cadence becomes familiar, almost historical. This pivot is never explained in detail. It is simply stated. The flood happens. Kingship descends again. Civilization resumes. The implication is unsettling. What existed before was not the first attempt. It was a previous cycle, now closed, its internal logic no longer accessible. The flood does not function as a beginning. It functions as a boundary. On one side lies a world that cannot be fully remembered. On the other lies the world of record, ritual, and repetition. The tablets treat this division with remarkable restraint. There is no grief, no nostalgia, no detailed account of what was lost. Loss is normalized. Restarting is expected. This framing suggests a civilization accustomed to collapse, not shocked by it, not traumatized into silence, but shaped by it. When destruction becomes cyclical, memory adapts. It trims itself. It keeps what is transferable and lets go of what cannot be stabilized. Origins, especially fragile ones, are poor candidates for survival in such a system. Before kingship descends, there is no described human struggle for dominance, no war of tribes, no gradual emergence of hierarchy. Authority simply appears. This absence erases a critical developmental phase. Humanity never learns to rule itself in the narrative. It is ruled from the outset. The tablets do not portray this as oppression. They present it as order. The Anunnaki fit seamlessly into this structure. They are not creators experimenting with a new species. They are managers overseeing an established workforce. Their concerns are allocation, balance, responsibility. They debate workloads. They assign duties. They complain of exhaustion. These are not beings standing at the dawn of time. They are participants in an ongoing system that predates the scenes we are allowed to witness. Even the creation of humanity, when mentioned, lacks grandeur. Humans are fashioned to relieve divine labor, not to fulfill a cosmic vision. This is not a moment of awe, it is a logistical solution. The universe already exists. The gods already exist. The problem is inefficiency. Humanity enters as a tool, not as a culmination. This utilitarian framing drains creation of mystery. It turns existence into a problem-solving exercise rather than a sacred emergence. The absence of a first beginning becomes more understandable in this context. When reality is treated as functional, its origin loses narrative importance. What matters is how things operate now, not how they started. The city itself becomes the true anchor of meaning. Each city is tied to a patron deity, a sacred center, a fixed point in an otherwise unstable world. Cities can be destroyed, but the idea of the city persists. It can be rebuilt, renamed, reassigned. This reinforces the sense of continuity without origin. Place replaces beginning. Archaeology quietly supports this worldview. Beneath the earliest monumental architecture lie simpler structures, then traces of abandonment, then rebuilding. Layers tell a story of repeated settlement rather than linear progress. Each layer assumes the land was already known, already used, already claimed. There is no untouched ground in the human imagination presented here. The psychological effect of living inside such a system is subtle, but profound. When every generation inherits ruins as well as instructions, the idea of a pristine starting point fades. History becomes a chain of recoveries rather than a march forward. The past is not a foundation, it is debris. Kingship, then, is less a birth than a resumption. The king restores order after chaos, reenacts divine patterns, maintains balance. His legitimacy depends not on founding something new, but on aligning with something old. The farther back that something recedes, the stronger its authority becomes. Vagueness protects power. By refusing to describe the first beginning, the tablets create a horizon that cannot be reached. Inquiry stops short of a point that remains perpetually out of view. This is not ignorance. It is a boundary condition. The story is allowed to start only after systems are in place, after hierarchy has descended, after memory has already been shaped by loss. What remains is a civilization that understands itself as living after an ending rather than at a beginning. The flood marks not creation, but amnesia. Kingship descends not to inaugurate humanity, but to stabilize what survives. The Anunnaki oversee not a birth, but a maintenance cycle. The silence before kingship is not empty. It is crowded with implication. Something existed. Something ended. What followed learned to speak without naming what came before, and in that choice history begins not at the source but at the scar. The Anunnaki are often imagined as towering creators, beings who shaped the cosmos from nothing and breathed intention into lifeless matter. This image owes more to later theological habits than to the tablets themselves. In the Sumerian record, the Anunnaki do not arrive with blueprints for existence. They arrive into a world already structured, already governed by forces they neither invent nor fully escape. Their role is narrower, more procedural, and in some ways more revealing. They appear as administrators of domains rather than architects of reality. Each Anunnaki holds jurisdiction over a function. Water, fertility, law, storms, boundaries. These are not raw elements being summoned into being. They are ongoing processes requiring oversight. The gods do not create the river, they regulate its behavior. They do not invent justice, they enforce it. Authority flows sideways and downward, rarely outward into something new. This distinction matters. Creation implies authorship. Administration implies inheritance. The Anunnaki inherit a cosmos with rules already in motion. They debate within councils. They submit to decrees. They are bound by oaths older than their current disputes. The universe they inhabit feels legalistic rather than creative, governed by precedent rather than possibility. The language of the tablets reinforces this. When gods act, they establish, decree, or assign. These verbs suggest organization, not invention. Even moments often translated as creation carry the weight of restructuring something pre-existing. Clay is shaped, blood is mixed, labor is reassigned. Matter and energy are assumed. The question of where they came from never surfaces. This administrative tone strips the Anunnaki of omnipotence. They are powerful but not absolute. They argue. They fear consequences. They attempt to avoid work. They respond to crises rather than anticipating them. This makes them feel less like primal forces and more like participants in an inherited system. Power is real, but constrained. The famous decision to create humanity exemplifies this. The gods do not sit in awe contemplating the meaning of life. They convene to solve a labor problem. Irrigation channels need maintenance. Agriculture demands effort. Divine work has become burdensome. Humanity is engineered as a solution, not as an act of love or curiosity. The universe is treated as a workplace. This framing subtly removes the Anunnaki from the position of origin. If they were not present at the beginning of existence, then they cannot be its source. They are mid-level authorities in a much older structure. Their knowledge extends far, but not infinitely. They remember events humans do not, but even their memory has limits. There are hints of higher principles operating beyond them. Concepts like fate, cosmic order, and decree appear as impersonal forces. Gods enforce these forces, but do not define them. When boundaries are crossed, consequences follow automatically, not by whim. This suggests a universe that operates on rules deeper than divine personality. In such a system, the absence of a beginning becomes less mysterious. The Anunnaki themselves may not know it, or if they do, it lies outside the scope of what they are permitted to govern. Knowledge is hierarchical. What sits at the foundation may be inaccessible even to gods. This interpretation challenges modern tendencies to project extraterrestrial or hyper-advanced origins onto the Anunnaki. The tablets do not portray them as bringers of technology or founders of civilization from scratch. They refine, standardize, and regulate practices that likely existed in more primitive forms before their involvement. Civilization is improved, not initiated. The cities under their patronage reflect this. Each city has rituals older than any single ruler. Temples are rebuilt on the same foundations again and again, as if honoring a memory that cannot be fully recalled. The Anunnaki preside over continuity, ensuring that patterns repeat even as details change. Their authority depends on memory, not innovation. To rule effectively, they must align with precedent. deviations provoke instability. When disorder erupts, it is described as a failure of maintenance, not a failure of design. The solution is restoration, not reinvention. This worldview carries an implicit warning. If even gods are bound to systems they did not create, then the origin of those systems lies somewhere deeper, perhaps permanently beyond reach. The tablets seem comfortable with this unknowability. They do not strain toward revelation, they accept limits. The Anunnaki are also deeply embedded in cycles. They sleep, awaken, convene, disperse. Their actions follow rhythms rather than linear progression. Time is layered, not directional. In such a temporal landscape, beginnings lose significance. What matters is whether the cycle continues. By portraying the Anunnaki as administrators, the tablets quietly shift responsibility away from them. They are not blamed for existence, suffering, or finitude. They manage outcomes within constraints. Humanity's position mirrors this. People work, worship, rebuild, all within inherited limits. No one stands at the center issuing first commands. This layered delegation creates a universe without a clear author. Authority cascades downward, but its source dissolves as one looks upward. Each level points to something higher or older, but never names it. The beginning recedes endlessly, leaving only function and duty in view. What survives in the record, then, is not a story of creation, but of management. The Anunnaki occupy a middle tier in a cosmic bureaucracy whose top remains unrecorded. Their silence about origins may reflect reverence, ignorance, or prohibition. The tablets do not clarify. They simply proceed as if the question does not belong to the living. In this light, the Anunnaki are not the beginning of the story. They are evidence that the story was already underway. Their presence confirms continuity, not genesis. They stand as caretakers of a world shaped by forces that never introduce themselves. And so the tablets speak of divine authority without divine origin, of power without authorship. The Anunnaki rule, but they do not begin. They administer, but they do not explain. The deeper truth remains unspoken, buried beneath layers of duty, ritual, and repetition, waiting in the silence that precedes every recorded decree. Beneath the cities of Sumer, the ground itself tells a story that the tablets only hint at. Layers of silt, compacted and silent, separate one phase of habitation from another. Archaeologists uncover them like paused breaths in the earth, moments when life retreated and later returned. These flood layers are not uniform, not singular, and not neatly aligned across regions. They speak of repeated disruptions rather than one definitive catastrophe. The tablets echo this unevenness. Floods appear again and again, sometimes local, sometimes vast, sometimes framed as punishment, sometimes as necessity. They do not function as a single turning point. They are interruptions in a long rhythm of collapse and recovery. Civilization does not end. It sheds a skin and grows another. This pattern reshapes how memory operates. When destruction is frequent enough, remembrance becomes selective. Only what can be rebuilt is worth preserving. Techniques, rituals, names of gods, outlines of authority survive because they are transferable. Detailed histories, nuanced explanations, and fragile knowledge do not travel as well. They dissolve between layers. The flood narratives themselves are remarkably restrained. They do not dwell on horror. They do not catalogue loss. They compress devastation into efficient symbols. Water rises. Life ends. A vessel survives. Order resumes. The emotional distance suggests familiarity. This is not the first time such a thing has happened, and it will not be the last. Geological evidence complicates the picture. The region between the Tigris and Euphrates is prone to unpredictable flooding. River systems shift. Coastlines advance and retreat. What one city experiences as annihilation, another may barely notice. Over centuries, these uneven disasters create a patchwork of memory. No single event dominates the collective past. This environmental instability forces a certain humility. Human structures are temporary. Settlements rise where conditions allow, then retreat. Knowledge adapts to this impermanence. What cannot survive water, fire, and abandonment is eventually deprioritized. Origins, especially abstract ones, offer little practical value in such a landscape. The flood then becomes less an apocalypse and more an agent of erasure. It scrubs away complexity. It simplifies the narrative. What remains afterward feels older, purer, more authoritative precisely because so much else is gone. Survivors inherit fragments and treat them as complete. This process produces a strange illusion of timelessness. After each reset, what survives appears to have always been there. Temples are rebuilt on ancient foundations. Rituals resume as if uninterrupted. The gap collapses in memory. Time folds over itself. The beginning of the new feels indistinguishable from the continuation of the old. The tablets participate in this illusion. They describe kingship descending again after the flood, not emerging anew. The language implies restoration, not innovation. The same divine order resumes control unchanged by catastrophe. This preserves legitimacy. Authority that survives disaster appears divinely protected. But restoration requires forgetting. The specifics of what failed before must fade. Otherwise, confidence collapses. By framing floods as cyclical and survivable, the culture absorbs loss without dwelling on it. Memory becomes shallow but stable. The deeper past sinks beneath the flood line. This has profound consequences for how origins are treated. Each flood pushes the true beginning further away. The earliest phases of human organization are erased not once, but repeatedly. What remains after multiple cycles is a distilled version of culture, stripped of its experimental stages. Archaeology reveals this compression. Earlier layers show variation in tools, building styles, and settlement patterns. Later layers converge towards standardization. Repetition increases as diversity decreases. Civilization becomes more uniform over time, not because it is progressing, but because it is simplifying to survive. In such a context, the absence of a creation story is not an oversight. It is an adaptation. To dwell on beginnings would require preserving memory across destruction, something the environment does not permit. Instead, the culture anchors itself in what can be repeated: ritual, hierarchy, labor. The Anunnaki fit neatly into this survival strategy. As divine overseers of cycles, they provide continuity across resets. Their authority transcends any single flood. By aligning with them, society claims stability in an unstable world. The question of where even they came from becomes irrelevant to daily survival. Flood myths from neighboring cultures echo this pattern. Each describes destruction followed by renewal, without deep interest in absolute origins. The emphasis is on preservation, not creation. A chosen survivor, a vessel, a remnant carries knowledge forward. What is carried is never the whole. This selective survival shapes consciousness. When history feels perpetually truncated, people stop expecting completeness. Gaps become normal. Silence becomes trustworthy. What is not remembered is assumed to be either unknowable or unnecessary. The flood layers beneath Sumerian cities are physical reminders of this mindset. Each layer marks a forgetting, a reset of assumptions. Writing begins after many such layers have already formed. By the time scribes press their signs into clay, the deepest beginnings are buried far below reach. What remains is a civilization fluent in endings but quiet about starts. Destruction is named, survival is ritualized, origins are left to dissolve into prehistory. The flood does not begin the story, it edits it, and so the ground holds what the tablets do not. Beneath the visible past lies a deeper one, washed smooth by repetition. Each layer of silt is a reminder that memory, like architecture, is built on what survives catastrophe. The beginning, if it ever had a clear shape, was carried away long before the first signs were carved, leaving only the rhythm of loss and return to define what history could be. What survives catastrophe is rarely memory in its original form. It returns altered, compressed, reshaped into symbols that can endure repetition. In Sumer, memory does not present itself as linear history. It disguises itself as myth, not as fantasy, but as a technology for carrying loss without naming it. Myth absorbs what cannot be preserved directly. It replaces detail with pattern. Events become archetypes. Characters become functions. Over time, the original referent dissolves, leaving only the outline. This is not failure. It is adaptation. In a world where destruction is cyclical, myth becomes the safest vessel for remembrance. The Sumerian myths do not read like recollections of a first age. They feel like echoes. Gods argue, cities fall, floods return, order is restored. The same motions repeat with different names. The past is not narrated as a unique sequence, but as a recurring condition. This repetition dulls specificity while reinforcing inevitability. What is striking is how little curiosity these myths express about their own origins. They do not ask where the gods came from in any sustained way. Genealogies appear, but they terminate quickly, fading into abstraction. The earliest figures are not described. They are named, then left unexplored. The myth gestures backward and stops. This suggests that myth here is not trying to explain the universe, it is trying to stabilize experience. By encoding memory into ritual stories, the culture ensures that loss can be acknowledged without reopening wounds that cannot heal. Myth becomes a form of anesthesia. It allows survival without full awareness. The language of myth supports this function. Actions are exaggerated, time is stretched, emotions are simplified. These techniques reduce cognitive load. They make the story easier to remember, easier to transmit, easier to repeat after disruption. Precision is sacrificed for resilience. In this framework, the absence of a creation myth becomes intelligible. Creation implies a unique, unrepeatable moment. Myth in Sumer favours what can happen again. Floods recur, kingship descends again, gods reorganise labour again. A singular beginning does not fit this rhythm. Instead, the earliest age is treated as a shadowy before time. It exists only to contrast with the present order. Chaos precedes structure. Silence precedes speech. Nothing more is said. To elaborate would risk destabilizing the pattern that myth is designed to protect. Comparative mythology reinforces this reading. Across cultures shaped by environmental instability, myths prioritize cycles over origins. The emphasis lies on renewal, not birth. The world is not created once, it is rebalanced repeatedly. Memory follows suit. The Sumerian listener would not have approached these stories as explanations of reality's origin. They would have experienced them as confirmations that the current order had survived worse before. The myth reassures rather than informs. It tells the listener that collapse is survivable, that authority will return, that labour will resume. This psychological function leaves little room for speculative inquiry. To ask too deeply about beginnings would introduce uncertainty, where myth aims to provide closure. The silence is protective. It keeps attention anchored to what can be controlled. Even the gods participate in this selective memory. They complain of burdens, fear consequences, negotiate compromises. They behave as beings shaped by prior events, not as timeless absolutes. Their myths reflect adaptation rather than omniscience. They remember enough to function, not enough to explain everything. There are moments when the myth nearly cracks. References to earlier destructions, earlier assemblies, earlier orders slip through. These moments are fleeting. They are not expanded upon. The narrative moves on quickly, as if stepping around a weak point in the structure. This restraint suggests cultural discipline. Storytellers knew where not to linger. Over generations, these boundaries hardened. What began as instinct became tradition. The myth's shape stabilized, and with it the limits of acceptable memory. Writing later fossilized these limits. Once myth was inscribed, its silences became permanent. Oral traditions can adapt, reintroduce lost elements, or respond to new pressures. Written myth resists change. It locks in both what is said and what is omitted. The result is a paradoxical clarity. The myths are rich in symbolism yet vague in chronology. They offer a sense of deep time without providing access to it. They imply vast ages without describing them. The listener feels antiquity without learning its details. This sensation may be intentional, or does not require information. Mystery often thrives on absence. By withholding the beginning, the myths preserve a sense of scale that explanation would diminish. The unknown remains larger than the known. From this perspective, the missing origin is not a gap to be filled, but a feature to be maintained. It keeps the cosmos open-ended. It prevents closure. It ensures that no one, human or divine, can claim total understanding. Memory encoded as myth becomes a compromise between forgetting and knowing. Enough is remembered to orient the present. Enough is forgotten to allow continuity. The balance is delicate, and Sumer appears to have maintained it deliberately. This balance also protects authority. If origins remain inaccessible, power cannot be traced to a human decision. Kings rule because kingship descends. Gods rule because order demands it. The absence of a narrated beginning removes the possibility of critique. What emerges is a civilization comfortable living inside inherited meaning. The past is acknowledged, not interrogated. The deepest layers are left untouched, like foundations too fragile to expose. Myth covers them gently, repeatedly, until the covering itself feels ancient. In this way, Sumerian myth does not explain why the world exists. It explains how to live inside a world that has already survived its own erasure. Memory becomes a tool, not a record. Silence becomes part of the story. And so the beginning remains unspoken, not because it was unimportant, but because it was too unstable to carry. The myth remembers what can endure. Everything else dissolves into the before time, where it no longer threatens the fragile continuity of the present. Modern distance introduces a different kind of silence, one that settles not in the clay but in the act of reading itself. The tablets arrive to us fragmented, filtered through layers of translation, interpretation, and expectation. Each stage reshapes meaning, sometimes subtly, sometimes profoundly. What appears as absence in the original record is often amplified or distorted by the lenses through which it is viewed. Translation is never neutral. The Sumerian language carries assumptions embedded in its structure, its verbs, its metaphors. When rendered into English, those assumptions are forced into a grammatical and philosophical framework shaped by very different traditions. Concepts of creation, origin, and causality do not align neatly across these systems. What was once a matter of arrangement becomes creation. What was continuity becomes beginning. Early translators often worked under the influence of biblical paradigms. They expected a genesis, a singular act of creation, a clear hierarchy of divine emergence. When the tablets did not provide these elements, translators sometimes filled the gap unconsciously, choosing words that suggested beginnings where the original text implied process. Over time, these choices hardened into convention. This introduces a quiet misalignment. Readers encounter phrases that sound like origin stories, yet the surrounding context resists that interpretation. The tension is subtle but persistent. The text seems to gesture towards something it never quite delivers. The problem is not that the tablets are incomplete, but that the expectations placed upon them are. Scholars have long noted that certain Sumerian terms lack direct equivalents. Words associated with shaping, fixing, or establishing are fluid, context-dependent. They describe actions taken within an existing field, rather than acts that bring something into being from nothing. Translating these verbs as create introduces an ontological weight they were never meant to carry. This linguistic slippage compounds over time. Commentaries reference earlier translations. Popular accounts simplify further. The Anunnaki gradually migrate from administrators to creators in the collective imagination. Not because the tablets change, but because the interpretive chain drifts. The absence of a clear beginning becomes paradoxically obscured by this drift. Instead of noticing that the text never names an origin, readers assume it is implied. Silence is mistaken for subtlety. What was never said becomes something said indirectly. The gap disappears, replaced by inference. Yet careful reading resists this closure. The structure of the narratives remains stubbornly midstream. Events refer backward to undefined precedents. Decisions respond to prior conditions never described. Authority operates within constraints whose source is unnamed. The beginning does not hide behind metaphor. It simply is not there. This challenges a modern impulse to complete stories. Contemporary culture is uncomfortable with unresolved origins. It seeks first causes, foundational moments, explanatory anchors. When ancient texts refuse to provide them, the refusal feels like a problem to be solved rather than a condition to be understood. Academic disciplines have also contributed to this discomfort. Archaeology seeks timelines. Philology seeks roots. Comparative religion seeks archetypes. Each approach pushes towards synthesis, toward a coherent narrative. The Sumerian material resists synthesis. Its coherence lies in function, not origin. There is also the issue of fragmentary survival. Many tablets are broken, their edges lost. It is tempting to imagine that missing beginnings once existed on those edges, now crumbled away. While this is possible in individual cases, the consistency of absence across genres and centuries argues against simple loss. Too many beginnings are missing in too many places. Modern reconstructions sometimes project hypothetical prologues, assuming that early myths must have started somewhere. These reconstructions reveal more about modern narrative expectations than about ancient practice. They impose linearity where the original culture may not have valued it. The danger of this projection is subtle erasure. By smoothing the text into familiar shapes, modern readers lose the opportunity to encounter a fundamentally different relationship with time and memory. The strangeness of the tablets is softened, their silence is domesticated. When translation choices are revisited, a different picture emerges. The Anunnaki regain their administrative character. Creation recedes into arrangement. The world appears less like a designed artifact and more like an inherited system. The absence of a beginning becomes visible again, not as a flaw, but as a structural feature. This reevaluation unsettles established narratives. It suggests that the oldest written civilization did not frame its reality around origin stories. Instead, it organized meaning around maintenance, balance, and survival. The implications extend beyond history into philosophy. A world without a narrated beginning invites a different understanding of existence. In such a world, legitimacy does not derive from being first. It derives from continuity. Authority is justified by endurance, not by origin. Knowledge is valued for its applicability, not its explanatory depth. The past matters insofar as it stabilizes the present. Modern readers often overlook this because they approach the tablets as precursors to later traditions rather than as complete systems in their own right. The expectation that Sumer must lead toward familiar concepts distorts interpretation. The culture is read as incomplete rather than complete on its own terms. The silence around beginnings, then, is not only ancient. It is perpetuated by modern habits of reading. Each generation inherits both the tablets and the assumptions layered upon them. To notice the absence requires setting aside the urge to resolve it. What emerges is a text that refuses to answer certain questions because it was never designed to ask them. The gap is not a missing chapter, it is a boundary of thought. Crossing it requires abandoning familiar narrative instincts. By recognizing this, the tablets regain their original strangeness. They speak of gods without origins, of kingship without invention, of humanity without a first moment. They describe a world already in motion, uninterested in explaining how motion began. The modern struggle to reconcile this reflects a deeper tension between two ways of understanding reality. One seeks beginnings, the other accepts inheritance. Sumer belongs firmly to the latter. Its silence is not ignorance, but orientation. As the layers of translation and expectation are peeled back, the absence becomes clearer, sharper, more deliberate. The beginning was not lost in translation. It was never offered. And that refusal continues to unsettle, not because it withholds information, but because it challenges the assumption that every story must start somewhere. When the gods of Sumer enter the narrative, they do not arrive as pioneers stepping onto untouched ground. They enter as inheritors, assuming authority over landscapes already shaped, cities already standing, and cosmic rules already in effect. Their presence feels less like an arrival and more like a smena of stewardship, a transfer of responsibility rather than an act of discovery. The myths describe divine councils convening to address problems that already exist. Labor is burdensome. Resources are unevenly distributed. Order requires reinforcement. These are not concerns of a universe freshly born. They belong to a system with history, wear, and precedent. The gods respond to conditions rather than creating them. This inheritance is visible in how divine domains are described. Each god receives a portion of reality, not a blank canvas. Storms, rivers, fertility, law, war all pre-exist divine oversight. The god becomes custodian, not inventor. Power lies in regulation, not genesis. Even the sky and earth feel ancient beyond narration. They are not born within the myth. They are assumed. Their separation is referenced as a past act, but the agent of that act remains indistinct. The event is acknowledged without explanation. like a scar whose origin no longer matters to those living with it. This suggests a worldview in which the cosmos is fundamentally old, older than its current rulers. Authority does not equate to authorship. To rule something does not mean to have made it. This distinction undercuts later interpretations that place the Anunnaki at the absolute beginning of all things. Inheritance implies loss. Something has been handed down, but not everything survived the transfer. Knowledge erodes, context fades. What remains is functional understanding, not total comprehension. The gods know how to operate the system, not how it came into existence. This mirrors human experience within the same culture. People inherit cities, rituals, laws, and expectations without knowing who first conceived them. Tradition substitutes for explanation. Usage replaces origin. The divine mirrors the human, reinforcing a universe built on succession rather than creation. The myths rarely celebrate novelty. Innovation appears risky, often punished. Stability is prized. The ideal god maintains balance, restores order, preserves patterns. Disruption threatens collapse. This reinforces the sense that the world is fragile, sustained by repetition rather than invention. The idea of a pristine first age holds little appeal here. What matters is not purity, but endurance. A system that has survived floods, rebellions, and divine disputes earns authority through survival alone. Its beginning becomes irrelevant compared to its persistence. This perspective reframes divine conflict. When gods argue or rebel, the tension is not between creation and destruction, but between different interpretations of duty. Conflicts arise over management, not over the right to exist. The universe itself is never at stake. It endures regardless of divine disagreement. The absence of a creation narrative thus aligns with a deeper philosophical stance. Existence is not treated as contingent or fragile. It does not depend on a singular act that could have failed. It simply is. What changes are the arrangements layered upon it. This stance removes the need for ultimate explanation. Meaning is located in maintenance. Ethics emerge from balance. Authority derives from alignment with enduring structures rather than from original acts. The gods legitimize themselves by effectiveness, not by authorship. Such a worldview resists the drama of beginnings. There is no moment of divine triumph over nothingness. There is only ongoing negotiation with what already exists. The cosmos is not conquered, it is managed. This management extends into ritual life. Ceremonies reenact order, not creation. They restore balance after disruption. They do not commemorate a first moment. The sacred calendar marks cycles, not anniversaries of origin. Time turns rather than progresses. The gods themselves are bound to this turning. They age, retreat, lose prominence. New gods rise, absorbing functions from older ones. Divinity evolves without ever reaching back to a foundational source. Power shifts, but existence remains constant. This fluidity undermines any attempt to locate a fixed beginning. If gods can change, merge, and fade, then their origins lose significance. What matters is their current role within the system. The past becomes a reservoir of authority rather than a chain of causation. Humanity's role mirrors this again. People are created but not exalted. They serve functions. Their value lies in participation, not in uniqueness. There is no first human celebrated as a singular ancestor. Humanity enters quietly, as a solution to an existing problem. This quiet entry reinforces the sense that life is layered onto an ancient world. Nothing begins cleanly. Everything attaches to what came before. Even creation feels like modification. By inheriting a world already shaped, the gods confirm that beginnings lie outside the narrative frame. The story starts where control becomes possible, not where existence begins. What cannot be controlled remains unspoken. This silence does not weaken the myth, it strengthens it. By refusing to explain everything, the narrative maintains depth. The unknown remains vast. The known feels provisional. The listener is invited to accept mystery without seeking closure. The Anunnaki, then, are not origins but evidence of continuity. Their authority signals that something older persists beneath them. They stand on a foundation they did not lay, enforcing rules they did not write. This layered universe leaves no room for a simple beginning. Existence stretches backward into obscurity, beyond gods, beyond memory. The story we receive begins only when order requires narration. Everything before that remains unnamed, not because it lacked importance, but because it lay beyond the reach of those tasked with preserving what could survive. The inherited world speaks through maintenance, not through memory. Destruction, in the Sumerian imagination, is never portrayed as final. It is disruptive, often violent, but ultimately temporary. Cities fall, gods withdraw favour, floods erase fields and homes, yet existence itself continues uninterrupted. This distinction matters. Apocalypse is not an ending of the world, but an interruption of order. What follows is not rebirth from nothing, but reconfiguration from remnants. This recurring rhythm reshapes how time is perceived. History does not move toward a destination. It oscillates between stability and collapse. Each cycle leaves traces, but never a complete record. Memory thins as it stretches backward, not because nothing happened, but because too much happened to preserve intact. In this framework, cycles of destruction function as filters. They determine what knowledge survives and what dissolves. Practical systems endure because they can be reconstructed. Symbolic authority survives because it can be reasserted. Abstract origins, however, lack immediate utility. They are among the first casualties of collapse. The flood narratives exemplify this filtering. The survivor does not carry encyclopedic knowledge of the past world. They carry seeds, tools, ritual instructions. What is preserved is what allows continuity, not comprehension. The deeper meaning of existence is left behind with the drowned. Each cycle compresses history. The past becomes shorter, more schematic. Events blur into archetypes. The first age recedes further from reach with every reset. Eventually, the beginning becomes indistinguishable from mythic fog. This compression explains why the tablets feel both ancient and incomplete. They represent not the first attempt to remember, but a later attempt, built atop layers of earlier forgetting. Writing captures a moment when memory has already been streamlined by survival. The Anunnaki occupy a crucial role in this process. As overseers of order, they bridge cycles. Their continuity provides a sense of permanence in a world prone to erasure. Even when cities fall, the gods remain. Their names persist. Their functions resume. This creates the illusion of timelessness. Yet even divine memory shows limits. The gods react to crises as if encountering them anew. They argue, panic, negotiate. Their responses suggest experience without detailed recollection. They remember patterns, not specifics. They know floods happen, but not necessarily why. This selective remembrance mirrors human coping mechanisms. Trauma often erases detail while preserving emotional outline. Repeated trauma intensifies this effect. The Sumerian world appears shaped by collective experiences of disruption, encoded into myth as generalized cycles. In such a setting, asking about the first beginning becomes impractical. It offers no guidance for surviving the next collapse. The culture invests instead in mastering repetition. Rituals are rehearsed responses to disruption. They do not commemorate origins, they prepare for recurrence. Kingship reflects this logic. The king restores order after chaos. His legitimacy depends on reenactment, not innovation. He performs ancient rites to realign the world. The past he invokes is not a historical moment, but a template. The absence of linear progression alters moral reasoning as well. Success is not measured by advancement, but by endurance. A good reign is one that delays collapse. A successful city is one that survives another generation. The future is not improvement, but continuity. This mindset leaves little space for speculative history. Curiosity about origins risks distracting from maintenance. It may even undermine confidence in inherited structures. Better to accept the world as it is, shaped by forces that cannot be fully known. The tablets reflect this acceptance. They do not mourn the lost first age. They do not attempt to reconstruct it. They move forward with what remains. The tone is pragmatic, even resigned. Survival outweighs explanation. Over time, this pragmatism becomes philosophy. Existence is framed as cyclical by nature. Destruction is not a failure, but a phase. Renewal is not miraculous, but expected. The world does not need a beginning to justify itself. It needs balance. This worldview stands in quiet contrast to later traditions obsessed with origin and end. Sumer offers neither a definitive start nor a final conclusion. It offers continuity under threat. The story remains open-ended, perpetually vulnerable to disruption. The cycles also democratize time. No single generation stands at the center. Each inherits ruins and responsibilities. The past is never pure. The future is never secure. Meaning is forged in repetition, not in uniqueness. What emerges is a civilization comfortable living after endings. The first ending happened long before writing. Subsequent endings are absorbed into routine. Memory adapts by letting go of what cannot be stabilized. The beginning, then, is not merely missing. It has been eroded by cycles of destruction that prioritize survival over recollection. Each reset pushes it further into obscurity, until it no longer functions as part of cultural consciousness. The tablets do not point backward in search of a source. They look sideways, focusing on relationships, duties, and responses. The past is a reservoir of patterns, not a narrative sequence. In this light, the silence around origins is not mysterious neglect. It is the outcome of repeated historical triage. Only what helps the world continue is allowed to remain. Everything else, including the memory of how it all began, is gradually washed away. What survives is a civilization defined not by its birth, but by its resilience. The story does not start at the beginning. It starts wherever the last collapse allowed it to resume. What endures across cycles of collapse is never accidental. Survival favors certain forms of knowledge and quietly abandons others. In Sumer, the knowledge that persists is practical, repeatable, and institutional. It can be taught again after disruption. It can be enforced. It can be rebuilt. Other kinds of knowing, speculative, ancestral, exploratory, fade first, not because they lack value, but because they lack protection. The tablets reflect this bias with striking clarity. Instructions for rituals survive. Legal codes survive. Administrative systems survive. They are copied, recopied, standardized. Their language becomes rigid, formulaic, resistant to change. These texts do not seek understanding. They seek continuity. This creates a peculiar tension. The civilization is advanced, meticulous, deeply observant, yet curiously uninterested in ultimate explanations. Astronomy maps cycles, not origins. Mathematics counts, measures, predicts. Medicine treats symptoms and signs. None of these disciplines reach backward toward a first cause. They operate within an assumed framework. The gods themselves embody this selective preservation. Their identities are tied to functions that matter for survival: rain, fertility, justice, protection. Abstract metaphysical principles remain vague, unnamed, or impersonal. The divine is actionable. It can be appeased, invoked, negotiated with. It does not invite speculation beyond what ritual requires. This is not intellectual poverty. It is strategic focus. Knowledge that cannot be operationalized is fragile. In a world of floods and rebuilding, fragile knowledge rarely survives. What remains is what can be encoded into routine. Over time, this shapes cultural memory. The past becomes a toolkit rather than a story. Events are remembered insofar as they establish precedent. Myths provide templates for behavior. Laws provide boundaries. The deeper narrative context dissolves. The absence of a beginning fits this pattern precisely. An origin story offers no immediate function. It does not tell people how to plant, trade, worship, or govern. It does not prevent the next disaster. It does not reinforce hierarchy in a tangible way. As memory compresses, it falls away. What replaces it is authority without explanation. Kings rule because kingship descends. Gods rule because they always have. The system justifies itself through endurance. Longevity becomes proof. The longer something lasts, the less it needs to explain itself. This dynamic is visible in how traditions accumulate. Later cultures inherit Sumerian structures without inheriting their lost context. They build upon them, reinterpret them, adapt them. Each layer adds meaning while further distancing the origin. The beginning recedes not only in time, but in relevance. Writing plays a decisive role here. Once knowledge is inscribed, it becomes harder to question. The written word carries weight. It freezes a moment of understanding and presents it as stable. Over centuries, that stability becomes authority. Yet writing also narrows possibility. What is written must be preserved. What is not written becomes suspect. Oral memories that once carried nuance and contradiction fade as written forms dominate. The past becomes cleaner, more uniform and less complete. This process creates an illusion of completeness. The surviving record feels comprehensive because it is consistent. Gaps are less visible when everything that remains agrees with itself. The missing beginning is not obvious because nothing contradicts its absence. Even later scholars, confronted with this coherence, are tempted to assume completeness. The silence around origins is interpreted as insignificance rather than loss. The system appears whole because it functions, but functionality is not the same as totality. A machine can operate perfectly while hiding its history of assembly. Sumerian civilization operates with impressive efficiency while concealing the deeper story of how it came to be. The Anunnaki, positioned as guarantors of order, reinforce this concealment. By anchoring authority in divine administration rather than creation, they remove the need for foundational narrative. The present order becomes self-justifying. This has psychological consequences. People living within such a system learn to orient themselves toward maintenance. They learn to repeat what works. Innovation becomes cautious. Inquiry is bounded. The unknown is acknowledged but not pursued. The result is a civilization that looks outwardly confident but inwardly resigned. The world is assumed to be old, complex, and beyond full comprehension. Humans carve out their place within it rather than attempting to master it. The absence of a beginning thus becomes part of a larger pattern of acceptance. Not everything needs to be known. Not everything can be recovered. Stability depends on letting some questions remain unanswered. This does not mean those questions never existed. It means they were not protected. They did not survive the filtering pressure of history. What remains is a curated memory, shaped by necessity. The tablets are monuments to this curation. They preserve order, not origin. They speak of gods, not genesis. They describe how to live, not how life began. Their silence is disciplined, consistent, and revealing. What is lost is not just information, but a way of relating to time. Without a beginning, history becomes a series of resumptions. Each generation steps into an inherited present, carrying tools and rules whose origins lie beyond reach. This creates a subtle sense of dislocation. The present is solid, but the past is hollow. Authority feels ancient, but its source is invisible. The world feels permanent, yet always on the verge of disruption. The Sumerian record does not resolve this tension. It normalizes it. The absence of a beginning is absorbed into daily life, into ritual, into law. It becomes unremarkable. What remains for later observers is a civilization that appears to have emerged fully formed, speaking confidently without ever explaining how it learned to speak. The beginning is not denied. It is simply no longer part of what survives. The flood, in the Sumerian imagination, is not framed as a cosmic reset button pressed in rage or regret. It is something quieter, heavier, and more enduring. It behaves like forgetting, made physical. Water does not just destroy structures, it erases distinctions, it blurs edges, it smooths history until only the most durable shapes remain. In the tablets, the flood is described with a calm that feels almost procedural. Warnings are given, preparations are made, survival is arranged, afterward life resumes. There is no sense that the world has been reborn, it has been thinned. What returns is less detailed, more schematic, easier to manage. This thinning is crucial. Apocalypse implies revelation. The flood reveals nothing. It conceals. It removes excess. It leaves behind a version of the world stripped of its earlier complexity. What survives feels foundational, not because it is original, but because it is all that remains. Memory behaves the same way. After trauma, especially repeated trauma, recollection becomes selective. Peripheral details vanish. Core patterns persist. The flood operates as collective trauma on a civilizational scale. It does not wipe memory clean, it compresses it. The survivor of the flood carries instructions, not stories. How to build, how to measure, how to offer sacrifice, how to restore order. These are procedural memories resilient under stress. The deeper narrative of how things once began is not among them. This explains the peculiar authority of post-flood order. What remains feels ancient, unquestionable, absolute. Not because it truly originates at the beginning of time, but because nothing older is accessible anymore. The absence of alternatives grants permanence. The tablets reinforce this authority by treating the flood as a boundary rather than an origin. Kingship descends again afterward, unchanged. The gods resume their roles. The cosmic hierarchy remains intact. There is no learning from the past collapse, no evolution of structure, only reinstatement. This reinstatement depends on amnesia. To resume without change requires not remembering why collapse occurred. Causes are mentioned briefly, often framed as noise, imbalance, or excess. They are not analysed. The system avoids introspection. Stability matters more than understanding. The flood myth thus becomes a narrative of survival without reflection. It teaches how to endure, not how to prevent. It prepares the culture psychologically for recurrence. Destruction is normalised. Recovery is ritualised. In this context, the absence of a beginning is reinforced by design. The flood cuts off access to anything before it. Even if earlier origins were once known, the narrative structure refuses to carry them forward. The story restarts without explanation, again and again. This creates a layered present. Each generation lives atop the residue of previous ones, inheriting rules whose justifications have been washed away. Authority becomes opaque. Tradition becomes heavy. The world feels older than memory. The Anunnaki preside over this process with impersonal consistency. They authorize the flood. They authorize the restoration. Their role is not to judge meaning, but to regulate balance. Humanity is not punished to teach a lesson. It is reduced to manageable scale. This managerial quality strips the flood of moral drama. It is not a warning. It is a correction. The system recalibrates itself. Excess is removed. Order resumes. The universe continues without commentary. What disappears in this process is narrative depth. The more times order is restored without reflection, the more history flattens. The past becomes a sequence of disruptions followed by restorations, indistinguishable from one another. The first disruption loses its identity. Over time, the flood ceases to be an event and becomes a condition. Civilization assumes that collapse will happen. Memory adapts by focusing on what follows collapse rather than what precedes it. The question of beginnings becomes irrelevant to survival. Archaeological layers mirror this mental landscape. Each flood deposit seals off an earlier world. Structures beneath remain intact but unreachable. They exist, but they no longer participate in meaning. Excavation is required to access them, and even then interpretation is partial. Writing emerges after many such layers have already formed. The scribes record what is visible, what is functional, what is authorized. The deeper past lies beneath literal and metaphorical sediment. It does not vanish, it becomes inert. The flood as amnesia explains why Sumerian history feels simultaneously deep and shallow. Time stretches far back, but detail evaporates quickly. The oldest eras are vast but vague. The more recent past is detailed but narrow. Memory tapers off like a submerged landscape. This tapering produces a sense of inevitability. If collapse is assumed, then origin loses urgency. Why dwell on beginnings when endings are guaranteed? The culture orients itself toward endurance rather than explanation. The flood myth teaches resignation without despair. Life continues. Order returns. Work resumes. The world is survivable, not comprehensible. This is enough. The silence around origins is thus reinforced at every level. Environment erases detail. Trauma compresses memory. Ritual prioritizes repetition. Writing fossilizes what remains. Each layer contributes to a culture that lives comfortably, without knowing how it began. The flood does not close the story. It edits it. It removes the prologue and leaves the body intact. What survives feels like the whole, because nothing else is accessible. This is why the tablets never call the Anunnaki the beginning. They arrive after forgetting has already done its work. They manage a world whose deepest past has been submerged beyond recovery. Their authority rests on continuity, not creation. The beginning is not denied. It is unreachable, buried under water, under time, under habit. The flood ensures that history always restarts too late to remember itself fully. Power rarely announces itself as a rewrite. It prefers continuity, the appearance that nothing essential has changed. In Sumer, authority settles into this quiet posture early. The temple, the palace, and the scribal school form a triangle of influence that shapes what is remembered and how it is allowed to survive. Within this structure, history is not erased, it is curated. Priests guard ritual knowledge, kings enforce order, scribes fix language into acceptable forms. Each role reinforces the others. Together they produce a version of the past that stabilizes the present. What survives does so because it supports existing hierarchies. What threatens them fades without confrontation. This is not an organized conspiracy. It is an ecosystem of power. Each institution acts in its own interest, and the result is coherence. Stories that justify kingship are preserved. Myths that reinforce divine oversight are repeated. Narratives that complicate authority lose relevance and eventually disappear. The absence of a beginning fits neatly within this system. A clear origin invites scrutiny. It invites comparison between then and now. It opens the possibility that things were once arranged differently. By leaving the beginning undefined, authority avoids this risk. The past becomes ancient but opaque. Kingship is presented as eternal, not because it always existed, but because its inception is never narrated. The same is true of divine hierarchy. The Anunnaki rule without origin stories that could humanize or contextualize them. They are simply there, as old as order itself. Ritual reinforces this timelessness. Ceremonies do not commemorate historical events. They reenact patterns. Each performance collapses time, making the present feel aligned with an unchanging past. The absence of a beginning allows ritual to feel perennial rather than commemorative. Writing intensifies this effect. Once a version of a hymn, lore, or myth is standardized, deviation becomes error. Copying replaces creativity. Over generations, the text acquires authority simply by persistence. The earliest surviving version becomes the only version that matters. In this environment, memory becomes conservative. It resists expansion. The scribes are not rewarded for speculation. They are rewarded for accuracy. Accuracy means fidelity to tradition, not to lost realities. The past becomes whatever the present can still verify. This selective preservation creates a narrowing corridor through time. The farther back one looks, the fewer acceptable narratives remain. Eventually, the corridor ends not in a beginning, but in sanctioned silence. Nothing lies beyond because nothing is allowed beyond. The role of the temple is especially significant. As the center of both economic and spiritual life, it controls surplus, labor, and legitimacy. The gods it serves must appear stable and authoritative. Their origins are irrelevant. Their power is immediate. Any narrative suggesting that divine authority emerged from conflict, accident, or contingency would undermine this stability. Such stories, if they ever existed, would have found little support in institutional memory. They would not be copied. They would not be taught. They would fade. The palace benefits from the same silence. A king who rules by divine favor gains more from ambiguity than from history. If kingship has no origin, it cannot be traced to human decisions. It simply descends. This framing removes responsibility from human institutions and places it beyond reach. Even law participates in this erasure. Legal codes are presented as restorations of ancient justice, not innovations. The king claims to renew order, not invent it. Law appears as something uncovered rather than created. Its beginning is always earlier than memory. Over time, this produces a culture that equates age with truth. The older something appears, the more legitimate it feels. But age here is performative. It is constructed through repetition and omission. What is repeated feels ancient. What is omitted ceases to exist. The Anunnaki benefit most from this arrangement. Their authority is immense, yet strangely unexamined. They are powerful because they are assumed to have always been powerful. Their lack of an origin story shields them from interpretation. This shielding extends into later cultures that inherit Sumerian material. Subsequent civilizations adopt the gods, adapt their names, merge their functions, but retain the silence around beginnings. The absence becomes tradition. What began as institutional convenience hardens into worldview. People grow accustomed to not knowing. The question of origin loses urgency. The world feels complete as it is, even if its foundations are invisible. This invisibility is not emptiness, it is density. Layers of power, ritual, and repetition accumulate until they block access to anything beneath. The beginning is not removed, it is buried. The danger of this burial is subtle. When origins are inaccessible, critique becomes difficult. Change appears unnatural. Authority feels inevitable. The present presents itself as the only possible arrangement. Yet beneath this stability lies fragility. A system that depends on silence must continually reinforce it. Each generation must be trained not to ask certain questions. The scribal curriculum, the ritual calendar, the legal tradition all participate in this training. The result is a civilization that appears confident but rests on unspoken assumptions. Its strength lies in repetition. Its vulnerability lies in what it cannot remember. The tablets we inherit are products of this process. They are not neutral windows into the past. They are curated artifacts, shaped by institutions invested in continuity. Their silence is meaningful, not accidental. By recognizing this, the absence of a beginning becomes more than a mystery. It becomes evidence of how power shapes memory. The Anunnaki are not named as the beginning because beginnings are dangerous. They destabilize what power seeks to preserve. What remains is a past that feels ancient yet unfinished, authoritative yet incomplete. The story begins where control begins. Everything before that is left in shadow, not because it lacked importance, but because it lay outside what authority could afford to remember. When the Sumerian record is placed beside the myths of other ancient cultures, a pattern begins to emerge that feels both familiar and unsettling. Across vast distances and linguistic boundaries, civilizations speak of gods who arrive into worlds already shaped, of floods that erase memory rather than create meaning, of ages that end without ever fully beginning. The similarities do not suggest copying, they suggest shared constraints. In Egypt, divine kingship appears fully formed, descending from gods whose origins dissolve quickly into abstraction. In early Indic traditions, cycles of destruction and renewal stretch so far back that beginnings become mathematically meaningless. In Mesoamerican cosmologies, worlds are created and destroyed repeatedly, each version incomplete, each origin provisional. The first age is always unreachable. These parallels do not prove a single source. They reveal a common response to instability. When environments are unpredictable and memory fragile, cultures converge on similar solutions. They frame existence as cyclical. They prioritize survival over explanation. They allow origins to fade into sacred ambiguity. What distinguishes Sumer is not the presence of this pattern, but its clarity. Writing appears early enough to preserve the structure of this worldview, before later theological systems impose linear beginnings and definitive ends. The tablets capture a moment when humanity still lived comfortably without a narrated genesis. Comparative mythology highlights how unusual later obsessions with beginnings truly are. The demand for a first cause, a singular creation, a moment when everything starts, is not universal. It emerges under specific philosophical and theological pressures. Sumer predates them. The Anunnaki, when viewed through this comparative lens, resemble administrative gods found elsewhere. They manage, oversee, enforce. They do not invent reality. Their authority is practical, not absolute. They belong to a class of deities shaped by inherited worlds. This perspective dissolves many modern projections. The urge to interpret the Anunnaki as advanced creators, outsiders, or architects of humanity reflects contemporary desires for external origins. It imposes novelty, where the ancient texts emphasize continuity. Archaeology supports this restraint. There is no clear technological leap corresponding to divine intervention. Progress appears incremental, uneven, adapted to local conditions. Civilization grows through accumulation, not sudden appearance. The mythic narrative mirrors this gradualism by refusing dramatic beginnings. Even when myths describe creation, it is partial and functional. Humans are made to work. Cities are founded to anchor worship. Order is restored to address imbalance. These acts respond to existing conditions. They do not initiate existence. Comparative study also reveals how later cultures reinterpret inherited myths to suit new needs. When stability increases, when empires expand, When centralized authority demands justification, origin stories harden. The beginning becomes a tool of legitimacy. Sumer exists before this shift fully takes hold. Its myths are pragmatic, not triumphalist. They reflect a world where authority must be maintained locally and repeatedly, not justified through grand cosmological narratives. This makes the silence around beginnings more credible, not less. It aligns with a worldview that does not require cosmic validation. The world is not explained, it is inhabited. The danger of ignoring this context is misinterpretation. When modern readers isolate Sumerian myths from their comparative setting, they may mistake absence for mystery alone. In reality, the absence is a choice shared by many early cultures, later overwritten. The comparative approach reveals that beginnings often emerge when cultures feel secure enough to speculate. When survival is less precarious, memory can afford abstraction. Sumer's environment did not encourage this luxury. Floodplains shift, rivers change course, cities rise and fall. Under such conditions, cyclical thinking feels natural. Origins feel irrelevant. The world is experienced as something that continues despite disruption, not something that needs justification. This helps explain why the First Age in so many myths is described vaguely. It functions as a conceptual boundary rather than a narrative space. It marks the limit of reliable memory. Beyond it lies sacred uncertainty. The Anunnaki stand just on this side of that boundary. They are old but not original, powerful but not foundational. Their presence confirms continuity without explaining its source. Comparative mythology thus reframes the central question. The issue is not why Sumer lacked a creation story. The issue is why later cultures insisted on one. The shift reflects changing relationships with time, authority, and memory. By placing Sumer within this broader pattern, its silence becomes intelligible. It is not an anomaly. It is an early expression of a worldview that later traditions would obscure. What remains striking is how thoroughly this silence persists within the tablets themselves. Even as myths evolve, gods merge, cities change hands, the beginning never crystallizes, the pattern holds. This endurance suggests deliberate preservation. The boundary around origins is maintained across centuries. It becomes part of cultural identity. The world is accepted as ancient beyond recall. The comparative view also reveals the cost of later reinterpretations. When origins are imposed retroactively, something is lost. The humility of inheritance gives way to the confidence of authorship. The world becomes a product rather than a condition. Sumer offers an alternative. It presents existence as something already underway, something that cannot be owned or fully explained. Authority manages, memory preserves selectively, and meaning emerges from continuity rather than creation. The Anunnaki are central to this vision, not as beginnings, but as evidence that beginnings lie elsewhere. Their silence echoes a deeper one, shared across early human cultures, shaped by environments where survival mattered more than explanation. By listening to that silence alongside others like it, the tablets speak more clearly. They are not hiding a lost genesis. They are preserving a worldview that never needed one. At the far edge of archaeological confidence lies a quiet discomfort. It emerges when material evidence suggests continuity deeper than accepted timelines, when layers refuse to align neatly with established narratives. In Mesopotamia, this discomfort has lingered for more than a century, rarely addressed directly, often softened by cautious language. Excavation uncovers order where disruption was expected, persistence where beginnings should have been. The earliest urban layers do not always behave like first attempts. Infrastructure appears mature, planning feels inherited, certain technologies emerge without obvious prototypes. This does not imply impossibility, but it strains the idea of sudden emergence. Civilization seems to arrive already practiced, already remembering how to function. Archaeologists respond with restraint. Explanations emphasize gradual development, lost sites, undocumented transitions. These explanations are reasonable, necessary, and often correct. Yet they also serve another function. They preserve the assumption that civilization must have a beginning that fits within known frameworks. Anything that complicates this assumption is treated as a problem to be resolved, not a signal to rethink the question itself. This creates a subtle tension between evidence and expectation. When findings suggest continuity beyond accepted thresholds, they are absorbed quietly, recontextualized, or left underexplored. The narrative adapts without acknowledging the strain. The beginning remains fixed, even as the ground beneath it shifts. Sumerian texts add to this discomfort. They describe institutions already in motion. Cities are sacred before they are founded. Laws are restored, not invented. Kingship descends into an empty space already prepared to receive it. These descriptions align uncomfortably well with archaeological impressions of maturity without visible infancy. The response has often been to treat myth and material separately. Archaeology handles stones and layers. Myth is assigned to imagination. This division maintains order, but it may obscure connection. When both sources gesture toward inherited systems, the separation becomes harder to justify. There is an unspoken embarrassment in admitting that the earliest civilization does not behave like a beginning. Beginnings are tidy. They fit diagrams. They allow progress to be measured. An originless continuity resists categorization. It suggests that history did not start where it was expected to. Academic caution plays a role here. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Without direct proof of deeper continuity, speculation is discouraged. This discipline protects scholarship from excess, yet it also narrows the range of permissible questions. The issue is not that archaeologists deny complexity. It is that complexity is often framed as developmental rather than inherited. The possibility that civilization resumed rather than began is rarely entertained, not because it is disproven, but because it disrupts methodological comfort. Sumerian silence around beginnings compounds this unease. If the culture itself did not record its origin, modern scholars are left without narrative anchors. Interpretation becomes tentative. Gaps remain open longer than usual. The temptation is to close them artificially. This closure often takes the form of assumed loss. The origin story must have existed but was destroyed. The first cities must have been simpler but left no trace. These assumptions restore linearity without evidence. They soothe discomfort without resolving it. Yet some scholars have quietly acknowledged the possibility that the record is complete in its incompleteness, that what survives reflects not damage, but design, that the absence of beginnings is not accidental, but intrinsic to how early societies understood themselves. This idea remains marginal, not because it lacks merit, but because it challenges foundational habits of thought. It asks history to accept that not all systems originate cleanly, that some emerge from recovery rather than invention. Such acceptance would require reimagining progress. Instead of a ladder, history becomes a series of plateaus. Instead of a point of origin, there is a horizon of loss. Knowledge accumulates unevenly, interrupted by collapse, resumed by memory fragments. The discomfort deepens when modern timelines are compared with environmental data. Climate shifts, sea level changes, and geological instability suggest repeated disruptions long before writing. Human presence likely adapted again and again, rebuilding patterns rather than inventing them anew. This does not demand speculation beyond evidence. It invites humility. It acknowledges that absence of proof is not proof of absence, especially when absence is precisely what repeated disruption produces. The reluctance to dwell here reflects more than academic caution. It reflects a cultural attachment to beginnings. Modern societies anchor identity in origins. They value founding moments. To accept an originless past feels disorienting. Sumer disrupts this attachment. It offers a civilization that functions without a narrated birth. Its confidence rests on continuity, not novelty. Its authority derives from survival, not invention. Archaeology senses this, even when it cannot articulate it fully. Each excavation uncovers order layered atop order, without clear rupture at the expected starting line. The ground resists simplification. This resistance creates a quiet embarrassment. The evidence refuses to perform as expected. It does not overturn established models, but it does not fully support them either. It lingers in ambiguity. The tablets echo this ambiguity. They speak fluently without explaining how fluency was acquired. They legislate without narrating invention. They worship without recalling revelation. They behave like inheritors, not founders. To sit with this discomfort requires patience. It means allowing the possibility that history does not always begin where writing begins. That civilization may be older than its records, not just in time, but in structure. The danger lies in rushing to resolution, in forcing the past to conform to present expectations, in mistaking silence for damage rather than intention. Sumer invites another posture, one that accepts unfinished knowledge, one that recognizes that some questions persist not because they are unanswered, but because they were never framed. At the edge of archaeological embarrassment, the absence of beginnings stands firm. It does not collapse under scrutiny. It waits, unresolved, suggesting that history may not start where certainty prefers, but where memory allows. There is a quiet unease that emerges when attention drifts too far backward, beyond the comfort of names and dates, into a time that resists ownership. In Sumer, this unease seems to have been understood intuitively. The tablets circle their past carefully, never stepping fully into it, as if aware that certain questions carry consequences simply by being asked. The danger is not ignorance, it is destabilization. To ask who came before is to invite comparison. Comparison weakens authority. If kingship had a predecessor, then it could be replaced. If divine order emerged from something else, then it is not absolute. Silence protects continuity. The Sumerian worldview appears to recognize this risk without articulating it. The myths do not forbid inquiry, but they redirect it. Curiosity is channeled toward ritual precision, astronomical cycles, omens, and signs. Knowledge expands sideways rather than backward. The past remains deep but undefined. This redirection shapes intellectual life. Scholars read the heavens, not prehistory. Priests interpret patterns, not origins. The unknown is approached through repetition and observation, not reconstruction. What matters is how the system behaves now, not how it began. Asking who came before would also fracture divine hierarchy. The Anunnaki rule because they are presented as the highest accessible authority. If something preceded them, then their rule becomes provisional. Power would appear inherited rather than intrinsic. That distinction matters deeply in a world built on divine legitimacy. The tablets preserve this boundary with remarkable discipline. Even genealogies stop short. They name parents, ancestors, lineages, but never chase them to a definitive source. The trail fades intentionally. The gods are old, but not explained. This restraint carries into human identity as well. There is no first human ancestor celebrated as the origin of all people. Humanity enters the narrative quietly, as a functional addition. No golden age of innocence is described. No primal couple anchors identity. People exist because the system requires them. This absence removes the burden of origin from human existence. Meaning is not derived from where one comes from, but from how one participates. Duty replaces destiny. Function replaces essence. Such a worldview discourages rebellion. If the world has always been structured this way, resistance feels unnatural. Change appears dangerous. Stability becomes a moral good. Asking about predecessors threatens that stability. The danger intensifies when catastrophe is remembered. Floods demonstrate how fragile order can be. After destruction, restoring the familiar becomes urgent. Speculating about what existed before feels indulgent, even irresponsible. Survival demands focus. The Sumerian response to this danger is subtle, not repressive. There are no prohibitions against asking. There are simply no rewards. The culture does not cultivate those questions. They wither from neglect. Later civilizations inherit this silence and reinterpret it. Some fill it with new beginnings. Others treat it as mystery. Few recognize it as boundary maintenance. The silence was not a gap waiting to be filled. It was a line not to be crossed. This line protects not just power, but coherence. Without a clear beginning, the world remains open-ended. It avoids final explanations that could collapse under scrutiny. The unknown remains safely distant. Modern fascination with origins often overlooks this protective function. To insist on a beginning is to impose closure. It resolves ambiguity. It creates a fixed point that can be challenged, revised, or rejected. Sumer avoids this vulnerability by never offering one. The danger of asking who came before is that the answer might be unsettling. It might reveal cycles of failure. It might expose forgotten collapses. It might undermine the idea that the current order is special or chosen. By keeping the beginning inaccessible, the culture avoids confronting these possibilities. The past remains vast but impersonal. It cannot accuse, it cannot instruct. It simply exists as background. This approach shapes emotional life as well. Grief over lost ages is muted. Nostalgia has no anchor. The present carries weight without comparison. People live inside continuity, not longing. The Anunnaki embody this stance. They are authoritative without origin, powerful without explanation. Their silence mirrors the silence beneath them. They stand as guardians of order, not storytellers of beginnings. To push beyond them would be to step into a space without narrative support. The tablets offer no guidance there. The reader is left alone with speculation, something the original culture appears to have avoided deliberately. This avoidance does not indicate fear, it suggests wisdom shaped by experience. A world that has collapsed before learns what questions fracture stability. It learns which mysteries are survivable and which are corrosive. The Sumerian record reflects this learning. It preserves what can be lived with. It releases what cannot. The beginning falls into the latter category. What remains is a civilization confident in its place without knowing its origin. Its strength lies in acceptance. Its fragility lies in repetition. The world continues because it has continued before. The danger of asking who came before is not that an answer exists. It is that the act of asking disrupts the delicate balance between memory and survival. Sumer chose balance. The tablets carry that choice forward. They speak fluently while withholding the deepest past. They invite participation, not excavation. They offer order, not explanation. And so the question remains unasked within the record, not because it lacked curiosity, but because it understood the cost. The beginning is left untouched, not out of ignorance, but out of restraint shaped by a world that had already ended once too often to afford certainty. History usually announces itself with confidence. It declares a first moment, a founding act, a line drawn between nothing and something. The Sumerian record refuses this gesture. It opens already underway, already occupied, already burdened with memory that no longer remembers itself. What remains is not confusion, but composure, a civilization that speaks without explaining how it learned to speak. This refusal does not weaken the record. It gives it gravity. By declining to name a beginning, the tablets force attention onto what endures rather than what initiates. Order matters more than origin. Continuity outweighs explanation. Existence is treated as a condition, not a question. The Anunnaki stand at the center of this condition, not as creators, but as stabilizers. They regulate, allocate, correct, and restore. Their authority is immense, yet curiously limited. They do not claim authorship of reality. They operate within it. Their power confirms that something older persists beneath even divine control. This layered structure leaves history without a foundation stone. Instead of a base, there is depth. Each layer rests on another, none reaching bedrock. The past stretches backward into obscurity, not as chaos, but as silence. A silence shaped by floods, collapse, institutional memory, and deliberate restraint. What emerges from this silence is a warning that does not announce itself as one. When history refuses to begin, it resists ownership. No group can claim primacy. No authority can trace itself to a sacred first act. Power becomes provisional, justified only by its ability to maintain balance. Later traditions will reverse this logic. They will anchor meaning in beginnings, justify authority through creation, and frame time as a line with a start and an end. In doing so, they gain clarity, but they lose humility. The world becomes a product rather than an inheritance. Sumer preserves the older posture. The world is something one enters, not something one explains. Knowledge is partial by nature. Memory is shaped by survival. Silence is not failure, but discipline. This discipline carries consequences. Without a beginning, there is no final explanation. Meaning remains open-ended. The present cannot appeal to a perfect past. It must justify itself through action, repetition, and endurance. The tablets embody this ethic. They do not comfort with origins. They do not promise resolution. They document a world that continues despite forgetting. Their calm tone reflects acceptance rather than certainty. To modern eyes, this can feel unsettling. The instinct to search for beginnings runs deep. It promises orientation. It promises mastery. Sumer denies this comfort. It offers instead a vision of history as accumulation without inauguration. The absence of a beginning does not imply emptiness. It implies excess. Too much has happened to be contained. Too many cycles have passed. Too many resets have erased their own causes. What remains is what could survive. In this light, the Anunnaki are not mysteries to be solved. They are reminders of limitation. Even gods inherit conditions they did not choose. Even divine order rests on something unspoken. Authority is always downstream from forces it cannot name. This perspective reframes the entire record. The question is no longer why the tablets omit the beginning. The question dissolves. Omission becomes orientation. Silence becomes structure. History in this form is not a story with a starting point. It is a landscape shaped by erosion and rebuilding. Meaning is found in paths worn deep enough to persist, not in origins long since submerged. The final impression left by the Sumerian tablets is not ignorance, but restraint. They demonstrate a culture that understood the fragility of memory and chose carefully what to carry forward. They preserved order, ritual, and duty, and allowed beginnings to fade. This fading is not tragic. It is functional. It keeps the present livable. It prevents the past from becoming a burden too heavy to bear. It accepts that some knowledge cannot survive without distorting what remains. The world presented by Sumer does not ask to be explained. It asks to be maintained. Balance replaces certainty. Continuity replaces revelation. The absence of a beginning becomes a quiet acknowledgement of limits. In the end, history that refuses to begin does something rare. It leaves space. Space for humility. Space for uncertainty. Space for the recognition that existence may not belong to those who describe it, but to those who endure within it. The tablets rest in that space, still and uninsistent, offering not answers but a posture toward time, a way of living after forgetting, a reminder that what matters most is not how the world began, but how gently it is carried forward once the beginning can no longer be reached.